Oriana hummed as she crushed a freshly picked marigold flower in her favorite mortar and pestle, which she loved because it was left over from her mom's days as queen, and the old marble fit in her hands like it was made for them. Plus, it had always been her dad's favorite. Holding it felt like holding a piece of him. "A sprig of eucalyptus," she said to herself, reaching for one of the colorful glass jars she kept beside the stove. "To disinfect." A smile found her face as she unscrewed the lid and plucked a single light green branch from the rest. Eucalyptus was one of her favorites. She dropped the plant into the mortar and pestle. It would work beautifully alongside the marigold, which was sun yellow and worked wonderfully for inflammation. When the eucalyptus was crushed to a powder as fine as the marigold dust, Oriana reached next for a jar of purple blossoms. "Lavender," she said, "for pain." Oriana did her best not to give much thought to her words as she ground up the lavender, paying attention instead to the warmth filling her chest. She made this salve every week, and still, the sight of the ground herbs, the yellow, green, and purple together in a beautiful harmony, brought a seemingly everlasting comfort. Her eyes tried to wander, but she returned them to the herbs, once again taking in the medley of colors. Oriana clicked her tongue. "You shouldn't do that," she told her eyes, imagining they could hear her. "There's nothing more lovely to see here than this." She held up the mortar and pestle. "I tell you every time, and you still don't believe me." Unfortunately for her, her eyes didn't respond. "How rude," she said with a small smile. She supposed no one had taught them manners. They were only eyes, after all. When the plants were all ground into the same fine consistency, Oriana set down the mortar and pestle and turned, crossing her yellow kitchen in 4 prancing steps. There on the wall was a shelf she'd made out of twigs and leaves she'd gathered from the forest. It was home to her vials of harvested honey. Oriana took one and returned to her spot at the counter, where, without a thought, she retrieved a measuring spoon from a nearby drawer. This was all old hat. She'd done it hundreds, if not thousands, of times. With the measuring spoon in one hand and the vial of honey in the other, she tilted the vial and watched the thick, sticky sap cling to the clay as it always did. "Oh, Tommy rot," Oriana said, her eyebrows tightening as she lifted the vial higher. "You are here to be used!" As if her words had reached it, the honey began to slip from its container and into her spoon. "Thank you," she said. She held still until the measuring cup was nearly full, then used its ceramic edge to take the few extra drops from the vial's rim. The spoon shone golden with the honey. Turning, she poured the syrup into a new bowl she had already set aside. "Honey," she said, "for healing." The honey trickled lazily down the bowl's pale blue edges, and she smiled and put the measuring spoon on the counter. "Now, sunflower oil." The oil in question stood on the other side of the cooktop, in a tall bottle that Dad said his father had once used for storing wine, and, he had whispered, the occasional magic potion. She never knew when to trust her dad's stories. He had a habit of pulling piffle from the air. But believing was more fun than doubting, so, unlike her mom, who warned against the danger of accepting stories as truths, Oriana had always listened to his tales with stars in her eyes. She grabbed the homemade sunflower oil and brought it back to the bowl, where she filled the measuring spoon once again. When the oil was close to spilling over the spoon's edge, she added it to the honey. "For protecting skin." Oriana put the measuring spoon in the sink beside her, then took the mortar and pestle and held it above the bowl. Her hands bore a tremble heavier now than it usually was. As earnestly as she could, Oriana whispered, "This would be a perfect time for some magic." Then she tilted the mortar and sprinkled the dust over the honey and oil. A flash of red snatched a corner of Oriana's vision. She took a sharp breath and rushed to move her eyes, again taking refuge in the salve's colors. "By the sun," she said, setting down the mortar and pestle, wiping her shaking hands on the front of her white blouse. "The herbs are just delightful when they join the mixture's yellow, aren't they?" She didn't know who she was speaking to this time. Herself, she guessed. But if she had no one to talk to but herself, that would mean she was painfully alone. So instead, she took the bowl in her hands and turned to show it to the table behind her, the one made of knotted oak wood. "See?" She lifted the bowl and attempted a hopeful smile, even though tears were pooling in her eyes. "It's ever so pretty." The table said nothing. Oriana took that as an agreement. Smile crumbling, she nodded and put the bowl back on the counter. She swiped her hands across her cheeks. "Ever so pretty." With her eyes trained on the window above the kitchen sink, she reached for the drawer to her left and blindly pulled it open. Through the small pane of glass, Oriana could see her garden. Bright red tomatoes and dark blueberries, lively green peppers and squash almost as yellow as a marigold. She lifted a wooden fork from the drawer and shut it, and as she began to mix the plants and oils, looked down as carefully as she could. Glimpses were hard to avoid when her hands were moving like this, but she could do it if she remained aware. Besides, she didn't want to miss this step. Stirring the ingredients was the best part. This was when the salve began to take form, when the honey and the oil agreed to hold the herbs together, and things that had never before met became friends. By the time the stirring was done, the liquid had turned to jelly, golden twine strewn with color. With a satisfied sigh, Oriana cleaned her fork on the rim of the bowl and set it in the sink, then rested her hands on the edge of the counter and peered down at the salve. She wanted to stand here a moment longer, just one more peaceful minute before she was forced to face the reason for the medicine. She imagined what it'd be like if she were a physician, if she wasn't making this for herself, but had been tasked with concocting a healing balm for an ailing citizen. It wasn't her cottage she stood in, but her apothecary. Oriana closed her eyes and let her mouth slip into a smile. She could almost hear the chatter of the other physicians, conversations about families and hobbies. Their footsteps passed by as they buzzed around the shop, searching for medicines and cures. But when she opened her eyes again, she was alone in her cottage, neglecting caring for her wounds in favor of wishing the world away. She wrinkled her nose at her thoughts. "You sound like Mom," she told them. "I can wish the world away if I want. It's not like I'm running out of time." The voice in her head quieted, probably because Oriana had made a good point. Triumphant, she grabbed the bowl of salve and made her way to the only other room in the cottage, her bedroom. While it was joined to the kitchen, it was marked by a change in the flooring. Glistening wood shifted to soft carpet as Oriana entered. It was small, barely big enough to house the fireplace, much less her bed, her books, her crafting supplies, which took up nearly half the space on their own, and her mirror. It faced the wall, and the stool before it had a fine layer of dust from a day of abandonment. Oriana sat on the stool and set the bowl on the floor, and she closed her eyes before taking hold of the mirror on both sides. She didn't want to see, but there was no other way to apply the salve, and without it, her wounds would begin to hurt in a matter of hours. Oriana turned the glass and set it against the wall again with a gentle tap, then folded her hands in her lap. When she was ready to face herself, she allowed her eyes to open. Shadow poured over her. It pulled down her eyebrows and the corners of her mouth. It struck her heart from its place behind her ribs and sent it sinking deep into her stomach, adorning her forearms and her neck like dreadful ornaments. Gracing the center of her forehead like a gruesome jewel were deep red gashes, patches where beautiful white scales had been torn from her skin and an elegant, shining horn had been wrenched from her head. Oriana had once possessed the beauty of a dragon and a unicorn. She had loved admiring the embellishments she was born with, but they had been taken from her, stolen, and replaced by open wounds of torn flesh and exposed muscle. They never healed, but the salve helped the pain. Oriana lifted the bowl to her lap and dipped her fingers in the warm, sticky mixture. She never knew how to feel when she looked at herself, for she barely recognized the person in the mirror anymore. Her face was gentle and kind. Her eyes were a radiant, luminescent purple. Her hair was long and shimmering white and curled just so, and every piece of clothing she owned she had made by hand. But she never saw those things. She only saw the wounds. Oriana lifted the salve from the bowl and set about spreading it over the injury on her head first, flinching every time her fingers met the mangled skin. This wound was always the most painful. She supposed it was the deepest. After all, ripping a horn from a unicorn's head wasn't easy. Her mom wouldn't have been able to do it without her magic.